Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is 30 Days of Night. Now, 30 Days of Night is a graphic novel written by Steve Niles and illustrated by Ben Templesmith and published by IDW. Now, this was originally published as a 3-part comic book series, which was published in 2002, but later on those 3 issues were all published into one graphic novel. Now, the story was originally a pitch for a movie, but Steve Niles kept getting rejected, so ultimately he just made it into a comic book after teaming up with Ben Templesmith. Now, it seems like Niles might have taken some inspiration from other places as well for this story. For example, there's an episode of the 80s Twilight Zone series called Red Snow, which has a very similar premise to this comic book series. It deals with the idea of there being an area where there's no sunlight for a number of months, and vampires use this to their advantage. Of course, that episode did not take place in Alaska. It actually took place in Russia, but it was the same basic idea. And even the whole idea of vampires in snow reminds me a lot of the Stephen King short story, One for the Road, which was published in Night Shift, which was basically about an abandoned small town during a snowstorm, and there were vampires there. It was basically Stephen King's sequel to his novel, Salem's Lot, but it seems like Steve Niles might have taken some inspiration from that short story. And the vampires in this story actually reminded me a lot of the vampires from the Richard Matheson novel I Am Legend, in terms of how vicious they were, and in terms of this whole idea of vampirism essentially being treated like a virus. And I know Steve Niles did eventually do a comic book adaptation of I Am Legend, so it definitely would not surprise me if I Am Legend was maybe somewhat of an inspiration for this story. Now, the plot of 30 Days of Night is it's set in this small town in Alaska called Barrow, which I believe is based on a real town, and basically this town is so close to the Arctic that there's this period starting in November where they experience roughly 30 days of no daylight. And the whole idea of this story is this gang of vampires use this to their advantage by cutting off these people's communications with the outside world, and during this period of 30 days of no sunlight, these vampires launch a massive assault against this town. And basically, over the course of the entire story, they just freaking slaughter every human they come across. And now there's only a small band of survivors led by the sheriff of the town, Ebbet, and his wife Stella. And that's the basic plotline of 30 Days of Night. Now, 30 Days of Night I thought was a pretty good comic. I had some issues with it, but I'll get to those in a second. But overall, I thought it was pretty good, and the book is just so, relentless. It's a brutal freaking story. These vampires, they kill children, there's child vampires, and the book is just gory as hell. And these are not even remotely sympathetic vampires. These are vampires that will straight up kill your ass and not even think twice about it. I think that's the main draw of this comic, is the fact that it is so brutal and it is so relentless. The book also seems to have kind of a weird, Western influence to it, especially the ending. You could definitely see an influence of the Western. My only real issue with this graphic novel is really the pacing. This book moves at an almost ridiculously fast pace, and a lot of times that could be a good thing, but for this story, I think it would have benefited from being a little slower paced. Because this book moves at such a quick pace, it really doesn't leave enough room for character development. The 2 main characters, Ebbet and Stella, they are likable characters for the most part, but once again, I would have liked to have seen a little more character development with them, and because this book moves so quickly, it doesn't really leave enough room for character development. And also, this entire story is supposed to take place over the course of a month, and and it doesn't feel like that because the book moves so quickly. So that's really my major complaint about this, is I think the pacing is too quick, and ultimately I think the story is just too short. This would have benefited from, I think, maybe Niles just expanding on certain things a little bit more and expanding on the characters a little bit more. Honestly, I think the main draw of this comic is actually the artwork by Ben Templesmith, and I think his artwork is the main reason why this comic book series caught on the way it did. Like, the artwork, I don't really know how to describe it exactly, but it's almost an abstract kind of artwork. Like, I'm normally not a fan of this kind of artwork, but for this particular story, the artwork fit the story very well. Now, in the book, there are references to a much larger mythology, and I know Steve Niles did do sequels to this, and I'm guessing the mythology gets expanded upon in the sequels. For example, there's this subplot in the book about this mother and son who are not from the town, who know about the existence of vampires, and they're trying to find proof of the existence of these creatures. But the way this subplot is in the comic, it doesn't really go anywhere. Like, it seems like it was an attempt to expand the mythology a little bit, but it really didn't go anywhere. Now, being that I haven't read the sequels, I don't know if maybe those characters are touched on in the sequels or not. But one attempt at really expanding the mythology that I do think Steve Niles did a really good job at was really touching on the politics of the vampire society. For example, the main villain of the story is this vampire named Vicente, if I'm saying that character's name right, who actually doesn't even want these other vampires to be doing this. Like, he only comes there because he's invited by the other vampires, but when he sees what these other vampires are doing, he's like, what the hell are you idiots doing? This is going to expose us to the human world and will endanger our species, and he's kinda right. And he takes part in the slaughter of these townspeople only because he kinda has no choice at that point, because he has to make sure there's no survivors. So, in a lot of ways, he's almost more so the main villain by default. So, in some sense, Vicente is almost a sympathetic character, because you realize that he's only doing this because he feels like he has to. That being said, he's still a bad guy, and once again, will kill you without hesitation. I did appreciate how Vicente was drawn to look like Count Orlok from Nosferatu. But once again, it really gets in-depth into the politics of the vampire society of this universe, and it talks about how they have to go to great lengths to hide their existence from the human world, because, once again, if their existence was known to the human world, they could be in danger. It even talks about how the vampires are purposely not turning any of the people in this town because they want to keep their population down. So that is one example of Niles doing a really good job at expanding the mythology, but overall though, I feel like there's a lot of other stuff in this comic that could have been expanded upon a little bit more, and my main issue with it is it's just too fast-paced. But despite some of my minor problems with this, I still recommend 30 Days of Night. Now, Steve Niles did do a couple of sequels to this graphic novel. There was 30 Days of Night Dark Days, there was 30 Days of Night Return to Barrow. Eventually the series, I think, kind of got spun off into sort of an ongoing comic book series, but there have been a couple of sequels to this graphic novel. There were even some 30 Days of Night stories that were not written by Steve Niles, but they were just stories that happened to take place in the 30 Days of Night universe. There was also a 30 Days of Night and X-Files crossover. Now, I've never read this one, so I don't know if it's actually canon with the overall 30 Days of Night continuity, or if it's sort of like what with DC they call Elseworlds, and I also don't know if it's supposed to be canon with the whole X-Files continuity. But then again, it is a spin-off of the X-Files, and a lot of the times when they do comic book spin-offs of TV shows or movies, that's like a real point of debate is, are the comic book spin-offs actually canon? Now, this graphic novel was adapted into a film of the same name in 2007, and I actually do like the movie. I know some people don't like the film. I personally enjoy it myself. Granted, it's been almost 10 years since I've watched the movie, so I might have to give the movie another watch, but I remember really liking it, though. Now, I know the second graphic novel of this series was adapted into a film as well, but I heard that one was really, really bad, and I know that one was direct-to-DVD. But yeah, that was my review on the graphic novel 30 Days of Night, written by Steve Niles and illustrated by Ben Templesmith, and bye.